Welcome back to Sensitivity Sessions, where we talk about how to find ease and purpose as a sensitive person in an overstimulating world. I'm your host, Stephanie Gardner-Wright. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and a coach for highly sensitive people. So today on our show, we have an audience question, which I'll be answering, and it's about the very common, very popular internet narrative currently that if you've been told by an adult when you were a child that you're mature for your age, it equals that you've experienced trauma. So we're digging into that to see, is that really true from a scientific and a developmental perspective, and is that true for sensitive kids? So here's the question. I've been seeing an idea that kids dubbed mature for their age had trauma and became adults with anxiety, people-pleasing, etc. Not to make my question black or white, but are sensitive kids also mature and likely to experience difficulties as adults unrelated to trauma? Okay, so quick disclaimer about my experience and maybe some of my bias that I have. I actually specialized in grad school in child and adolescent trauma. Most of the first 7 years of my career, I worked pretty much exclusively with kids and teens that had experienced some really intense variety of traumas. So this is something that I'm personally really interested in, and I've had quite a bit of professional experience, both from a theoretical standpoint and also experientially treating these kids in therapy, some of whom were definitely sensitive. That's kind of my bias on that in my perspective. And we can't talk about this without diving deeper into what behavior markers adults are calling mature. So what are the behaviors or the things that adults are looking at with these mature kids and saying, oh, that's mature behavior? So let's define that first so that we can have an idea of what that looks like and get on the same page. So when I think of the behaviors that adults typically will say, oh, you're so mature for your age, that often looks like a kid who's quiet, not impulsive, thoughtful, can carry a conversation about deep matters, that has conversational skills, has good manners, is considerate of other people, and can make sometimes startling observations about people and situations that just seem to have a wisdom beyond their years. Some people will say, this kid's an old soul, they have this wisdom, they're mature for their age. There's a variety of ways that people will talk about this, but the kind of common thread that this person is asking about in the question is there's this particular brand of internet video that's popped up saying, if you're mature for your age, if you've been told that, it's not something that is positive. It actually means that you've had trauma and you may not know about it until you're watching this video. So I'm really interested to explore this thought some more. Many HSP kids, so highly sensitive children, also fit that profile of quieter, more introspective, attuned to others, and socially aware. Now, some of them are extroverts as well, so not all of them are going to be introverted, but there is a larger proportion, about 70% of all highly sensitive kids are introverted. So we do have to acknowledge that, and even the extroverted ones will tend to be more introspective and more thoughtful, typically speaking. So they also tend, perhaps, to act more mature because of that awareness, because they're very attuned to social cues. So trauma is absolutely one reason of many why an adult might look at a child and say, wow, you're so mature for your years. It absolutely is one reason why a child may seem more mature, but we lose a lot if we're not considering innate temperament and sensitivity. If we're just looking at a child who appears to be more mature in some way than their peers, again, by what we've defined as more socially aware, more introspective, deeper thinker, has those social skills or wants to be part of the adult conversations, even if we automatically look at those behaviors and go, that child's been traumatized, we're really not seeing the full picture. We're really pigeonholing ourselves into one reason why children may appear more mature. Let's actually define trauma, because we also need to get on the same page about what trauma means, and because this term is slung around a lot on the internet. And sometimes the people that are sharing about trauma actually have no idea what it actually means. Trauma is very individual, and the definition of trauma that's most accurate is that trauma is really anything that dysregulates your nervous system and your greater systems to the point where you are unable to cope in the moment. you cannot self-regulate, it is too much, and actually traumatic memory is then coded very differently in the brain and in the body than non-traumatic memory. So we know that it gets scrambled. People just are not able to process in the moment. It's like you're stuck or frozen is a way that you can think of that. So let's talk actual examples of how trauma can affect either someone's perception of how mature you are or your actual maturity level. One major way is a sense of a foreshortened future. And all that means is that someone who's experienced trauma often has difficulty being able to see themselves at a certain age. So they might say, I know I'm not going to make it to the age of 30. So I'll just live it up. I'm not going to save for retirement. I'm not going to worry about the future because I know I'm not going to live that long, or just not even being able to imagine that they're going to reach adulthood. That's a very common way that the sense of having a foreshortened future will show up. And there's a certain lack of caring that comes with that. And that can be really linked to another way that this maturity or perceived maturity can show up, which is risk-taking behavior. So sometimes when adults are looking at minors' behavior and they're seeing it as mature, it's because it's risky behavior. So these are things, again, that are linked to the foreshortened future. If I'm not going to live long enough either to see the consequences of this, or if I don't have to worry about what happens to my body, then I can just do whatever. And that ties into with sometimes the sense of meaninglessness or sense of despair that people can experience after trauma. Another way that adults can see this maturity in kids who have been traumatized is that there's a loss of the childish innocence that we associate with childhood. So these children will often seem more cynical. They'll seem older than their years, and you can even see it in their eyes often, like they've seen too much of the world already at a young age, or that they're cynical. And cynicism is anathema to typical child development. Most children who are not traumatized and do not have an experience or series of experiences like that cannot be cynical because it's not part of the innocence of childhood. Sometimes what adults are interpreting as poise or being quiet, so not being disorderly and running around, sometimes these things, especially with traumatized children, are because they are being watchful, they're wary, maybe specifically of adults, or in general, they're waiting to see if a situation is safe. They're watching out, even at a subconscious level or at a physical level, they're looking out for potential signs of danger or threat. And so that watchfulness, that wariness can appear as if it's maturity, because a younger child that you developmentally might expect to be running around and just very freely expressing themselves is more restrained. And sometimes that is due to trauma. Another behavior marker that adults may see in specifically traumatized kids and interpret as maturity is an inability to relate to other children, specifically because of the traumatic events that they've experienced. So, for instance, this may feel like I can't relate to other kids because they haven't gone through what I've gone through. They can't understand. Or there's often beliefs that kids who've been traumatized have about their self-worth, about other kids are better than me, I'm dirty, there's something wrong with me. Especially if there's sexual abuse, there's a real sense that a child is less than, or there's something innately wrong with them that would cause someone to abuse. And I'm saying that that's a belief that children typically have. It's obviously not true. No child ever does anything or deserves to be abused. But that's a common belief that sexually abused children and physically abused children will often have. So this is really a common thing that we see where these kids feel a sense of shame about themselves and they hold themselves back from being with other kids, or maybe they even have some contempt for other kids because of that sense that they can't relate to that innocence anymore. Okay, so quick recap so far before we get into the second part of the question, which is, are sensitive kids likely to experience difficulties as adults that are unrelated to trauma? So before we get into that, we've defined trauma. We've defined how adults can look at kids who have been traumatized and perceive those behaviors as being mature. So that speaks to some of the internet dialogue about how kids that seem mature may have actually experienced trauma. But we also talked about how it's important not to assume that just because a child seems more mature in whatever way you want to quantify that they've been traumatized, and that's actually a pretty inaccurate, direct conclusion to make. And we've also talked about how sensitive and highly sensitive children can appear more mature simply because of their tendency temperamentally to be more introspective, to need to pause to check. So they need to take more time before they choose to engage instead of rushing headlong into something, which is a classic marker of environmental sensitivity. And they also tend to be deep thinkers who want to have deep discussions and think deeply about things, and often want to seek out adult conversation for that reason. So these are other reasons why a temperamentally sensitive child could also appear mature, or why children in general could appear mature for reasons other than trauma. So the second part of the question, are sensitive kids likely to experience difficulties as adults unrelated to trauma? I would say potentially. The science suggests a couple things. So let's quickly talk theory, and then we'll get into some more examples of that. Differential susceptibility is a big concept that you should know about if you're interested in sensitivity at all. And this simply means that children are more or less sensitive and have distinct innate differences in how they respond to environmental stress. With differential susceptibility, those most sensitive people are both most likely to struggle in an adverse or unsupportive environment, and also the most likely to thrive and flourish in a supportive environment. So there's a both and there very strongly. And this is in contrast to the classic diathesis stress model, which a lot of psychopathology is based off of, which posits that people are more vulnerable from a genetically influenced standpoint to environmental stress. But this goes beyond that and says, actually, yes, you can have this plasticity in where you are more affected by environmental stress, but also you're more positively affected by a supportive environment. And along with this, we also need to talk about biological sensitivity to context, which is where heightened physiological reactivity, so read high sensitivity, when you're very responsive and reactive to what happens around you and within you. This heightened stress reactivity is also linked with greater sensitivity, both to very adverse and also very nurturing, specifically childhood environments. So you're going to be more sensitive to both really tough environments and also very supportive environments growing up. Now, here's the really interesting thing about this, in my opinion. So here's a direct quote from one of the studies. It's Boyce et al. In 1995, if you're interested. Highly reactive children in high-stress families or childcare centers sustain significantly higher rates of respiratory illness than their low-reactive peers did. But equally reactive children, so read highly sensitive children, in low-stress settings were the healthiest of all the children in the samples. By contrast, the respiratory illness incidence of low-reactivity children was unresponsive to environmental stress levels, showing approximately the same mid-level illness rates in both low and high-stress conditions. So the upshot of this being that kids that were lower on the scale of sensitivity were not as impacted, either positively or negatively, by their environment. So I find this really interesting that the highly sensitive kids were more susceptible to getting a respiratory illness in a high stress environment. Like their immune system was more impacted by that, is what I'm taking from that. But that also, they were the healthiest kids in the lower stress environments, more so at a statistical significance, more so than the kids that were lower sensitivity. So with this in mind, this means that high sensitivity in children can be protective as well as possibly vulnerable factor. If there is a low stress environment, that these highly sensitive kids are actually doing much better on average than a child with more of a low to medium sensitivity profile. So moving on from theory to some more common challenges unrelated to trauma that highly sensitive adults might experience more than the general population. So here are the things that I've noticed as a clinician and as someone who specializes in working with sensitive folks, is that the typical work grind without meaning is particularly soul-crushing. And not to say that people that aren't highly sensitive don't feel this way too, but I think more often, more sensitive folks will experience this sense of meaninglessness of, I'm just getting up every day, going to work, coming home, eating food, showering, going to bed, and doing it all over the next day. What is even the point of life? You can look at that as a spiritual journey. You can look at that in some other way, but it is a more common experience with highly sensitive people that there is this dissatisfaction or even this deep sense of unfulfillment of just going and doing the same rote thing every day and not feeling like there's a deeper meaning behind it. So needing this sense of meaning and purpose, or really, really struggling with the lack of that, is one of the biggest challenges that I see for adult sensitive folks. Another one is anxiety, and this is apart from trauma. Obviously, anxiety can be a feature of trauma, but we're talking now specifically about people who have not experienced some deep trauma or do not have PTSD. So anxiety is a very typical feature of being highly sensitive. Elaine Aron, who you may have heard of if you're anywhere in the highly sensitive sphere, she's the one that has done a lot of the initial research on highly sensitive people, and she's the one that came up with the term highly sensitive person. I was lucky enough to be in a training from Elaine Aron where she was speaking only to clinicians, and she made a really interesting observation that has provided me with a lot of food for thought, which in her belief, highly sensitive people are always trending more towards anxiety than your average person, simply because of the depth of processing. Depth of processing is a feature that's very much associated with high sensitivity, and that's whether you're talking about environmental sensitivity or sensory processing sensitivity in the scientific literature. So depth of processing being the term to mean that every piece of information that's coming in, whether that's visual information, other sensory information, things that you're noticing about your internal state or things that you're perceiving about the world around you, all of that information is being processed more thoroughly and in more depth than someone who's less temperamentally sensitive would do. So there's some anxiety more inherent in that because we're living more in the past and the future than most people are because of the deep processing. We're reflecting on things that we've been through already, and actually highly sensitive people are more likely to reflect on things that have happened in the past that are reminding them of current things that are happening. So this linking of, I've felt this before, I've kind of been here before in another way. We do that much more than someone who might be less sensitive. And there can be some anxiety when we think about the past, maybe things that we regret, things that we would do differently next time, or in the current iteration of ourselves, or when we think about the future and we get into the what if game and can spiral into, okay, I have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, but what do I do? What's going to be the best decision? We might tend to overthink at times because of that depth of processing. So that can be some of the more troublesome side of being highly sensitive, is this tendency to be anxious because we're more in the past and more in the future by nature of this depth of processing. And along with that overthinking that can come with the depth of processing can be trouble making decisions. So again, we're taking in so much information all the time as highly sensitive people at that deeper, more thorough level of processing that it takes time to process. It's not that we can't process information. It's high sensitivity is not about a lack of ability to process. It's actually about we are so able to process things so deeply that we need more time to do. The example that's coming to me is if you have a heavy duty gaming system that you're trying to, not a gamer by the way, but if you have a heavy duty gaming system that you're trying to install, it's going to simply take more time to load than it would, I don't know, one of those games that we played back in the 90s. And it's just going to take more time because there's more information there. The visuals are going to be more refined. There's more complexity to the game. And so there's simply more heft and data to the software that needs to be uploaded on your computer. So that's kind of how I think of it. There's so much more happening. There's so many more associations that we're making. We're not only processing what's happening in the moment, but also this is reminding me of this past thing that happened, or this is like that. I'm drawing on my past experiences and linking it to the current thing that is happening. We also have to be processing that. So indecision and having a tough time making decisions is one of the tougher parts of being a highly sensitive person as well. That's not related to trauma. It's just an inherent part of the trait. And of course, this trait shows up different for everyone that's highly sensitive, but this is a more typical feature that more people probably experience than not. Really, maybe being afraid of making the wrong decision, wanting to optimize a decision, because we're also wired to anticipate positive things. We get a lot of pleasure as HSPs from anticipating something positive that's going to happen and getting to plan that sometimes. For me, that shows up with travel. I get back from somewhere and I'm already thinking about where's the next place we're going to go, and just savoring that planning experience of imagining all the fun things that we're going to do and that my family is going to get to do on this future trip, for instance, that we're going to go on. So because we really get this pleasure out of anticipating the fun things that are going to happen, we often want to optimize those things, and we want other people to have fun. We want to see their joy, because as HSPs, we're so wired for other people's responses to things. When we're noticing someone else's response, we're sensing that more. Our mirror neurons, that are the neurons that allow us to kind of step into someone else's shoes of what they might be experiencing, they're more active in highly sensitive people than they are in less sensitive people. And that's what the fMRI studies have demonstrated so far. That's all wonderful, but it can also be taxing and draining and challenging if we don't have ways in place to take care of ourselves. So if we are stuck in that indecisive place, for instance, because we don't want people to have a bad time, we're feeling responsible for making this decision that other people will be part of, it can really get us stuck and feeling unable to make a decision. So at that point, it's really important to work on some skills of how can I either be okay with not being responsible for someone else's emotions and just letting them have whatever time they're going to have and doing the best that I can, but knowing that I'm not responsible for someone else's emotions or their experience. There's maybe some work to be done there on the level of responsibility that we take, but we can also reflect to ourselves when we're noticing that we're really getting overloaded, we're sensing that our nervous system is getting really heightened because we're getting into anxiety mode and preemptively worrying about things. A lot of that is getting an awareness of our physical state, signs that we're starting to go along that road. So maybe, your palms start to get sweaty, you start to get this feeling in the pit of your stomach. It might be different for everyone, but everyone has these telltale signs that they're starting to get really anxious or stuck in somewhere where your mind is just kind of spinning around and around and it feels like you can't get anywhere. So that's a good opportunity when you notice that that's starting to happen for you to take a break from what you're doing. If you're in the middle of trying to make a decision, allow yourself to step away from that decision and come back. Or say, okay, if this is not a major life decision, I'm going to give myself 20 minutes to look at some of the research or the Amazon reviews with this, and then I'm going to make a choice. And you know what? I can probably go back and either return that thing if I order something I don't like, or if I need to make a different decision, I can probably do that. So those are some of the adaptive skills that we can use in order to take the edge off some of this tendency to need more time to make decisions, which, by the way, it's not a bad thing to need more time to make decisions. We just might have to change our expectations of how we should be operating in life and give ourselves more buffer time, or maybe not force ourselves to make decisions when we're depleted, when we're feeling like we're lacking sleep, or we haven't had enough exercise, or we're not taking care of ourselves, maybe that's not the moment when we make a big decision. Maybe we allow ourselves to take care of ourselves first so that we can make decisions. I kind of alluded to this earlier, talking about how HSPs typically need to have a sense of fulfillment from work or their chosen thing that they're doing with their life. Obviously, work is just one part of life, but HSPs, in my opinion, are more susceptible to depression, especially if they're not feeling fulfilled in life, because really depression at the core of it is a sense of, is this all there is? I'm feeling like I'm not progressing in the way that I want to. I'm really thinking these negative beliefs about myself. There's a sluggishness typically inherent with depression where everything kind of slows down. Our thoughts slow down. We're less active. We want to do less. We're kind of hibernating more. So obviously I'm greatly simplifying the experience of depression here. It can show up in a variety of different ways, but depression is often, for folks in general, it's often linked with a sense of futility about life, or feeling like there's no meaning, no personal sense of purpose. And not to say that finding a sense of purpose is a magic wand, it's certainly not. But at the same time, if we as HSPs are more likely to need a sense of purpose or feeling connected to a greater whole, greater than ourselves, if we are lacking that and if we're feeling this intense separation, we can easily become depressed. So that can absolutely be a challenge of being highly sensitive that's not related to trauma necessarily. And last one for today that I'll mention on common challenges that highly sensitive adults can face that are not related to trauma is a sense of feeling different from other people. Now, people that have experienced trauma absolutely do feel different from other people, but that's not the type of differentness that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this sense of I'm wired differently than other people. I'm more sensitive than them. I'm more impacted by things that other people don't seem to be. So feeling different specifically in that kind of way. Not so much the way that it would show up with trauma typically is no one else can relate to me because they haven't seen the horrors that I have, or they haven't been through what I've been through. They are like in a different happy world that I'm an outsider and I can't enter into. That's more of a trauma-specific belief of the differentness that highly sensitive people, and to a greater extent other folks that are neurodivergent, is a sense of I literally function differently than other people, and so they maybe aren't able to understand me because their brains are wired differently. They aren't as aware of certain things or affected by certain things as I am. Whether you're highly sensitive or you identify as another neurodivergence, what can be helpful is finding people that can kind of grok with you. They either function similarly, or maybe they're not also highly sensitive, but maybe they have another neurodivergence, and you can kind of get that your brains are more neuroatypical, in which they're functioning different than your average in the middle neurotypical person. So if you can find your people, and whether that's in in-person setting or an online setting, obviously there's a lot of online communities that have sprung up where you can find like-minded folks. When I found out that I was a highly sensitive person and really resonated with a lot of the things within that trait, I did not know a single other person in my life that even knew about the concept of high sensitivity. So it was in talking and sharing with people that were close to me about the trait that actually some people close to me were serendipitously able to relate to that as well, to feeling more highly sensitive. Or even if they didn't, they were able to hear that and respect that. So even if you don't know anyone personally at this time who's highly sensitive, don't automatically assume that other people in your life won't get it. Some of them actually might also be more sensitive and just not be aware of that languaging or the concept of this trait. So to sum up, it really depends whether sensitive kids are likely to experience difficulties as adults that are unrelated to trauma. It depends very much on the environment and the level of stress there, whether it's a low stress environment or a high stress environment. And that will unlock some of the innate genetically influenced parts of the trait, where people will absolutely tend to struggle more if there's been a high stress environment in childhood. If we've had a really positive experience growing up, or it was largely supportive, then the situation will be very different, where highly sensitive kids can actually thrive and do even better than less sensitive kids. This was such a fun question to answer. Thank you so much to the audience member who submitted it. That's our show for today on sensitivity sessions. I'm your host, Stephanie Gardner-Wright. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you found this valuable, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps more people become aware of this show and hopefully find some helpful tips if they're highly sensitive. I will talk to you on the next episode of Sensitivity Sessions. Bye for now.